Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. जय राधा गोपीनाथ, राधा गोपीनाथ श्री राधे। जय जगन्नाथ, जय जगन्नाथ, जय बलदेवा, जय सुभद्रमाई। जय गौरानिताय, जय गौरानिताय, जय गौरानिताय, जय गौरानिताय। जय जय प्रभुपाद, 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 जय जय प्रभुपाद। Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada. Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajikacharya Ashtatarashata Shishimari's Divine Grace Abhay Charanadavinda Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Bol. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto number 3, chapter number 5, entitled The Vidura's Talks with Maitreya. Text number 32. Tamaso bhuta sukshmadir yatakam lingam atmanaha. Tamaso bhuta sukshmadir yatakam lingam atmanaha. Tamaso bhuta sukshmadir Yata kam lingam atmanaha. Tamaso bhuta sukshmadir Yata kam lingam atmanaha. Tamaso bhuta sukshmadir Yata kam lingam atmanaha. Word for word translation. Tamasaha, from the mode of passion. Bhuta shukshma adi, subtle sense objects. Yataha, from which. Kam, the sky. Lingam, symbolic representation. Atmanaha, of the Supreme Soul. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Abhay Charanadavinda Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: the sky is a product of sound, and sound is the transformation of egoistic passion. In other words, the sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. Purport: in the Vedic hymns it is said, Etasmad Atmana Akasha Sambhutaha. The sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. Those who are egoistic in passion and ignorance cannot conceive of the personality of Godhead. For them the sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. It's a short purport, so I'll read until 36. This is text number 33. Kala mayamsa yogena bhagavad vikshitam nabhaha Nabaso nushritam sparsham nikurvan nirmame nilam. Thereafter the personality of Godhead glanced over the sky, partly mixed with eternal time and external energy, and thus developed the touch sensation from which air in the sky was produced. Purport: all material creations take place from subtle to gross. The entire universe has developed in that manner. From the sky developed the touch sensation, which is a mixture of eternal time, the external energy, and the glance of the personality of Godhead. The touch sensation developed into the air in the sky. Similarly, all other gross matter also developed from subtle to gross. Sound developed into sky, touch developed into air, form developed into fire, taste developed into water, and smell developed into earth. Okay, I'll leave it here. We'll stay at 33. Om Jnanatimurandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivas Adigaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So, just to recap what we're studying so far, because it is a technical section of Srimad Bhagavatam, it talks about the manifestation of, as Nrsimha Prabhu was mentioning, Sarga, which is the first creation, the original creation, but done by the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. So in this section of Srimad Bhagavatam, texts number 23 to 38, Maitreya Rishi is explaining the process of creation. Now this particular section of creation starts from the Lord as the only seer before Maya even becomes manifest. So it's mentioned that Bhagavan alone existed prior to the creation of the universe as one without a second. In other words, neither the Purusha avatars nor the demigods existed. And then from him came the Purusha avatars, the Pradhan, and from that came Krishna himself, or rather the Lord of Mahavaikuntha, Karanadakashaya Vishnu, impregnating Pradhan. And by looking at Pradhan, then he activates her. Just like a husband will wake up his sleeping wife, similarly Karanadakashaya Vishnu woke up the external energy, just so that living entities can purify themselves of their contamination and somehow or other come back home, back to Godhead. Now, after that happened, then the Mahatattva again transformed by the glance of the Supreme Personality Godhead, mixed with the modes of nature, and it was produced here the three things, that the ego is mixed with the three modes of goodness, passion and ignorance. So the goodness, Vaikarika, made the mind, Taijasa, Indriya, the senses, and Tamasa, or the elements. So Adideva is the doer, which is the mind, and it produced from the mode of goodness. Adiyatma, Karana, the cause, produced the senses which came from passion, and then you have Adibhuta, Karya, the effect, which produced from the elements from the mode of ignorance. So this is the false ego mixing with the three modes. Now after that it's mentioned the false ego again, rather they didn't mix, rather the false ego is manifested in three phases, my apologies. They're manifested in goodness, passion and ignorance, and that's the mind, senses and the elements. Now when false ego is in goodness, that's when the mind of the demigods are produced. False ego in passion, the senses, the speculative knowledge and fruitive activities are produced, and false ego ignorance is produced. When false ego in ignorance produces the senses and the gross elements. Now that's how we come to this point, how sound produces the sky, which is the quality is sound. Sky plus the Lord's glance plus time plus external energy produces touch, and so on and so forth. All of these senses, they come into existence beginning from the subtle state, which is what Prabhupada is talking about in the purport today. How from the sky developed touch, and that touch mixture with eternal time, with the external energy and the glance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that developed into air. So step by step, from subtle to gross. And you'll see that sort of carried through in terms of the shell of the universe. It begins from the inside with earth, and then it ends on the outside with false ego. So it goes from subtle to gross in, and to get out we go from the other way. In fact, when you read in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, it's mentioned, I believe it's Dhritarashtra, when he was quitting his body, it's mentioned how he merged all of the elements within the source of the elements. And you'll see that in many places throughout Srimad Bhagavatam, when it's mentioned how Yudhishthira Maharaj, he left, how Dhritarashtra left, how Kardamuni, I think it's Kardamuni, or was it, it's not Kardamuni, Prithu Maharaj. It's mentioned that how they merged the senses back into the elements and back. And you can see there they go from the gross all the way to the subtle. They start from the body, and then they go through the mind, and then back into false ego, and then they quit their body in that way. So when you read that in Srimad Bhagavatam, you can link it immediately to the creation. As creation is unraveled in one way, it is then again raveled back in the other way. It goes from subtle to gross, and then again it's wound up from gross to subtle. Now, this particular purport of 32, Prabhupada's mentioning that the sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. Those who are egoistic in passion and ignorance cannot conceive the personality of Godhead. For them, the sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. So here, this idea of the Supreme Being, or the Absolute Truth being all-pervasive, great, full of everything, and insurpassable, that is represented in material nature by the sky. And often you'll see that relation being made, how the Lord is extremely inconceivable, just as the sky is vast, the Lord's glories are very vast. So those who are not in the personal conception, in other words, those who are not free from contaminations of material existence, for them to be able to understand the Supreme Lord and His characteristics, qualities and so forth, it's very difficult. The closest thing they can come to is what Prabhupada says here, that they'll perceive the sky as the Supreme. In fact, for them the sky is a symbolic representation of the Supreme Soul. So later on in Srimad Bhagavatam you'll come across how, or rather I think it was the second canto, how Sukadeva Goswami mentions the Virat Rupa and how many worship the Virat Rupa. And by understanding the Virat Rupa, they come from the speculative knowledge or a vague understanding of the Supreme to a personal understanding of the Supreme, just by studying and understanding the Virat Rupa. And there you'll see that it's mentioned the Virat Rupa's eyes are represented by the sun and the moon, and then you'll start seeing how the clouds are his hair, and all of these different manifestations of material energy are connected to the body or the form of the Virat Rupa. Although the form of the Virat Rupa is in one sense temporary, just as the material universe comes and goes, similarly the form of the Virat Rupa is temporary, but it is used as an instrument or a tool for the jnanis or those who are high speculative philosophers to understand the personal aspect of the Supreme Lord. So it comes, as we were mentioning previously, that it comes from the false ego. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that only those tesham tvanta gatam papam jananam punya karmanam te dvanda moha nirmukta bhajante ma dridhavrtaha. Those who are free from material contaminations, only they will be able to engage in my devotional service. So it's mentioned that, and you can see very clearly here that Prakriti Purushasto hi bhunkte prakriti jan guna karnam guna sangasya sadasad janma yonishu. There Krishna mentions that it is the living entity coming in contact with the modes of material nature. It is due to another section of Bhagavatam, karma deva netrena, that the living entity, due to false ego, performs activities which causes karma, and that causes one to be bound up in material world. And because of that constant struggle for material existence, Maya's covering potency and pulling potency covers the conditioned soul's original nature. And by covering the soul's original nature, the soul is no longer able to perceive of its original self, its original identity, nor is it able to understand the Supreme Self, Krishna. And it is from that contamination that causes one to be unable to perceive Krishna, unable to serve Krishna. Because what will happen if you see it from a practical point of view, practical means physical point of view, when you engage your senses in something with your mind thinking of something else, then the activity itself is contaminated. You won't be able to achieve success in that particular activity. Similarly, by serving Krishna with ulterior motive, the reciprocation of love is stunted. Because you'll be approaching the Lord with something in mind, some remuneration or some sort of ulterior motive in mind, which will cause the relationship or the reciprocation to be stunted. Whereas if you see in the relationship between the gopis and Krishna, the gopis' mindset was simply just to serve Krishna's senses. So throughout Srimad Bhagavatam, wherever you hear that the gopis were feeling lusty for Krishna, that the gopis wanted Krishna to come back to Vrindavan, that the gopis weren't satisfied without being with Krishna, all of these things, the basis was they knew how to satisfy Krishna's senses, and they knew that no one else could satisfy Krishna's senses the way they do. Because Krishna himself mentions that he's not satisfied as much that people glorify him with the Vedic hymns as much as he's chastised by his beloved consorts. Because their mood is of that of service, complete unalloyed devotional service. It's known as Anya Abhilishita Sunyam, that it is completely free from karma and jnana and yoga. Whereas unfortunately, we are full of Anya Bilishita Purna. We are full of these ulterior motives. In Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, during the Gundicha Marjanam, or the cleaning of the Gundicha temple, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur mentions there that Mahaprabhu is teaching us how to receive the Lord within the heart. And that is by thorough cleaning of the heart. And it begins with Cheto Darpana Marjanam. That thorough cleaning of the heart begins with Param Vijayata Shri Krishna Sankirtanam. It begins by chanting the holy name of the Lord. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So the mirror of the heart is covered, it's caked with a layer of dust. And unfortunately, when you look at a mirror that's covered with dust, you won't be able to see the self very clearly. And Mahaprabhu is teaching us that first clean that mirror. First understand yourself as Gopi Bhartur Padakamalayur Dasa Dasa Anudasa. And this is a very significant point, because if you don't understand your identity, you won't be able to act appropriately in that spiritual nature. Because what will happen is that you'll be being contaminated, you'll be performing so many activities that the spiritual activities will become contaminated by the material activities. Take, for example, Kapila Dev's teachings in the later half of the third canto, where one performs devotional service in the modes of nature. That is a prime example of performing devotional service with contaminated mindset. And that's why it's required to continuously chant Hare Krishna. That cleansing process needs to always be there. But the interesting thing with chanting Hare Krishna is that that is also the end game. We chant Hare Krishna to chant more Hare Krishna. Yes, one of the products or byproducts of chanting Hare Krishna is that we'll become free from material existence. In other words, we'll be able to see the self. Evam eva atmani drishyate. You'll be able to see the self for what it is as a servant of Krishna, and you'll be able to engage in Krishna's service, being freed from the miseries of material existence. That's just a side byproduct. Actually, the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra gives us pure love of God. And pure love of God is just not simply love. Prabhupada explains bhaja and bhakti, they are two different things. Bhakti means devotional service. Bhaja is nothing, it's not just worship. Devotional service is not just worship. Devotional service includes activity. Love means to serve. So therefore, one's activities and mind needs to be completely pure to be on the platform of Anya Abhilishita Sunyam. Now in that Gundicha Marjanam pastime, in the purport, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur mentions that we need to clean the heart, and that begins by cleaning the mirror of the heart. And then once the mirror of the heart is clean, then again the cleaning process continues. Just as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu cleaned the whole Gundicha temple top down once, he then again asked his associates to go again and clean it until all the finer particles are removed. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada quotes there that actually the heart needs to be cleansed for the Lord to be received within the heart. If we receive the Lord within the heart, then that means that the Lord is actually already within the heart, but we have not received Him yet. We have ignored Him lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, to the extent that we become conditioned to not hearing what He says within the heart. Therefore, He has to go to the extent of externally manifesting Himself as the spiritual master, so that we can perceive Him, unfortunately. Because we have become so desensitized that everything is based on the senses now. And in Kali Yuga, that is the prime principle, manda sumanda matayo manda bhagya hi upadritaha. That the living entities are so unfortunate, so short-lived, that they are not able to even understand spiritual life. And spiritual life is the finer subject matter. What are living entities simply concerned with in material world? They're simply concerned with the senses, the body. That's it. Nothing more and nothing less. In fact, that is the point Prabhupada was mentioning previously in this chapter, that it is important to understand that the material energy and the spiritual energy, the living entity, are two different energies of the Lord. If you understand them like the material scientists as the same, then you're no different from the common man, common living entities, thinking that the body and the soul is the same. So it's a very important point Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur mentions. And then he finally says that we need to clean the heart from all of these contaminations. And these contaminations are represented by this desire for karma, jnana and yoga. Desire for fruitive activity, mental speculation and mystic perfection. If we give up these things then and engage in devotional service purely for Krishna's pleasure, then we'll be able to understand Krishna as he is. That Atashi Krishna Namadi Na Bhaved Grahayam Indriye Sevan Mukhi Jivado Swayameva Spurati Yada. It begins with the tongue. Recently we were hearing Nishinga Prabhu was relaying how Ganesham Prabhu mentioned in one class that the senses can be starved if you want to control them. But unfortunately the strongest sense, the sense of taste, the tongue. If you starve the tongue, it will come back to you manyfold, much more powerful. So therefore Mahaprabhu is so kind that Sarira Avidya Jal Jadendriyata Hekal Jiva Pile Vishaya Shagare, that this body is like a lump of ignorance, and it's a pathwork or a network of the senses are a network leading towards death. You know what a network is like? A network is very difficult to trace. You start from one point and to get through and get to the other side, it's very difficult, like a maze. It's a network leading towards death. You perform one activity which causes another activity which causes another activity, and by the time you realize it, you find yourself in the hellish condition of life. So the senses are the most difficult to control, and of the senses the most difficult to control is the tongue. That Narad Muni mentions that Sevan Mukhi Jivado Swayameva Spuratyada, that the Lord will manifest himself to those who engage their tongue in his service. And how does it begin? It begins by chanting Hare Krishna and taking prasadam. The diet and the medicine, Prabhupada says. The medicine is chant Hare Krishna and the diet is prasadam. And if you simply stick to taking only Krishna prasadam, Prabhupada says you'll become naturally purified. Naturally you'll become clean. Clean in mind and habit, just simply by chanting Hare Krishna and taking Krishna Prasad. So it begins from this false ego conception of this body being the body, and it needs to end in understanding that we're not the body, we're the servant of Krishna. Now, coming back to this point of the Anya Abhilashita Purna and Anya Abhilashita Sunya, that the living entity by nature is free from the contamination of material existence. But due to coming Anadi Bahirmukh Jeev, Anadi, I think the verse is here. This is from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Again, I'm referring to Sanatana Goswami, talks with Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And there he says that Krishna Buli se Jeev Anadi Bahirmukh Ataev Maya Tare De Samsara Duk, that the cause is forgetfulness of Krishna, and that's what causes the miseries of Maya. And this is what happens since time immemorial. So what happens here is that from this conception of forgetfulness of Krishna, Krishna has to go through the extent of creating the material universe. And how does he do it? He does it in a very particular way. And he does it by first manifesting pradhan, mahatattva, the senses, the objects of the senses, and even subtler than that, the tanmatra. That's, you're dealing with touch, taste, form, sound, all of those things. So this step-by-step process Krishna personally does, or through his expansion, Karnadakshaya Vishnu, shows us how much he's very particular in dealing with us. That he's going to the extent of making sure this place is manifest properly. If you continue reading this section, 36-37, Prabhupada emphasizes on this point that actually nothing has been able to be done by material nature on her own. That maya dakshena prakriti suyate sacharacharam hetana nena kanteya jagat viparivartate. That in every stage of the transformation of the material nature, Krishna's glance was involved. The eternal time was involved. And what does that tell you? It tells you that Krishna is the controller. Krishna is the proprietor, and Krishna is the best friend. Krishna is the controller because only by his glance does the material nature transform and manifest into what it is now as the cosmic manifestation. It's Krishna who's the proprietor because it is from him everything emanates, and it is him alone who existed in the beginning. And he's the best friend because he's engaging all of these activities, although he's unaffected by it. He's engaging in these activities simply to facilitate the living entities coming back home, back to Godhead. And not only does he create the material universe, he then enters it again and then assists Brahma, or rather gets Brahma to assist him in creating the individual universes. And then again he enters into the heart of all living entities as Kshirodakashaya Vishnu. As the best friend, he then travels with the living entities up and down throughout the universe, waiting for that time that the conditioned soul would then give up material nature, give up material endeavors, and then turn his face towards Krishna. Therefore, Narad Muni says that tasyeva heta prayateta kovido, that the living entity who is intelligent understands that just as material happiness comes of its own accord, just as distress comes of its own accord, so does happiness. So rather than endeavoring up and down from Satya Loka all the way down to Patala Loka, looking for happiness, one who's self-realized or endeavoring to be self-realized will understand that it will come of its own accord and will go of its own accord. Therefore they should engage in Krishna's service, in understanding the absolute truth, how to get out of material existence. Now, this point of the external energy in the glance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Another point to be mentioned is that this idea of proprietorship. So we talked about how Krishna is the controller, Krishna is the best friend. This proprietorship is very important because the way we use material energy will dictate how we'll get out of it. I think it was mentioned a couple of verses ago. That actually, no, I was reading elsewhere, that Prabhupada's mentioning that our problem is that we see the external energy as separate from Krishna. We don't see it as an energy of Krishna. We see Krishna, okay, you've got your own internal potency, now this external energy is ours to enjoy. Right? So that is the cause of our usurping Krishna's property. In other words, this all belongs to Krishna, it should be engaged in Krishna's service, but we think that let us push Krishna out of the picture and let us engage everything here for our own pleasure. That's the beginning, or that's the cause for our existing in material nature, this enviness of Krishna. Prabhupada, when he was on a morning walk, he was walking down the street and then he saw the skyline of the metro, I think it was New York or it was San Francisco. He saw the skyline of all the buildings in the city, and then he pointed at it with his cane and he said, or rather he saw next to it in front of him, he saw a playground for children, and he pointed at the playground and he said that this is the children's playground, and then when he pointed to the skyline he said this is the adults' playground. So like children will get the toys, like for example a child will get from the mother a toy play set or a play set, a kitchen play set to be able to cook and pretend to cook. Seeing the mother do the activities, the child will think, okay, I should also do like that. I want a stove, I want to cook, I want an oven, all of these things. Similarly, we have been given all of these facilities to try and satisfy and enjoy our senses and to become frustrated with that endeavor and then to go back home, back to Godhead. But unfortunately, the false ego is so much ingrained, this false conception of life is so much ingrained in our consciousness that when we see an object, immediately we think it's for our pleasure. Like when you see a rose, when you see the rose, immediately the first thought that comes to mind as soon as the senses come in contact with the rose is how to enjoy the rose. Whereas for a devotee as soon as they see the rose, they'll think of it as an opportunity to offer to Krishna. Krishna should enjoy this rose. So in the same way, when we have a look at everything in material existence, that is the mentality we have. Every single thing we come in contact with is simply geared towards trying to satisfy our senses. In fact, it's mentioned that when we engage our senses in trying to enjoy the objects, the desires multiply and multiply and multiply. There's an example in the 5th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam of a merchant going through the forest. Now Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur takes this a step further and mentions that this merchant going through the forest trying to find good valuables to sell and enjoy, he comes across a tiger, and the tiger starts to chase him and he runs away. And this merchant runs and runs and runs and finally finds a well, and he jumps into the well holding on to the top of a branch over the well, hoping that the tiger will not catch him. And as he's catching hold of this branch above the well, he notices a few things. He notices that below him he sees, in one version it says there's crocodiles, another version it says snakes, and these snakes are multiplying. And on top of that, what he's seeing is that on the branches there are mice chewing away, but he's only hold, preventing him from falling into the well. And above the well, in the edge of the well, he sees the tiger circling around. And after going through all of this, then he suddenly feels a cool drop on his head. And when he looks up, he sees a honeycomb. And he puts his tongue out to try and enjoy that one drop, and he thinks he's satisfied. This is an analogy or a metaphor for the living entity wanting to enjoy material existence. That the rats, they're black and white, represent day and night. They're eating away at one's lifespan. In other words, days and nights are coming and going, and the living entity is engaged in material activities thinking that he'll never die. But unfortunately, he'll come to that stage. And when he looks down, the options of escape are very bleak. There's nothing much he can do. Either he can go down and try and satisfy his senses, and the desires and the reactions of that activities will multiply again and again and entangle him. Otherwise, he has to go and face the tiger of time, which will inevitably cause his death. But being in such a precarious situation, that one drop of honey is enough for him to forget the difficulties of material existence. To think that, okay, for all of these difficulties, just to get this one drop of honey, it was worth it. It's kind of like consolation prize. When you're in a competition and you're competing with everyone, when you're unable to win the prize, just to give you enthusiasm, just to what is the word? To appreciate? Encourage, that's the word. Just to encourage your endeavors, just to encourage you to further perform. They give you a consolation prize. And the consolation prize is generally nothing you can be very proud of. Right? It's just simply, for the sake of it, you've got something just to satisfy, your patch up the ego that you failed, you lost. So same way, material nature is giving us just a drop of what seems to be happiness, but it's just absence of distress. That's all it is. That happiness we perceive is just a momentary absence of distress. Just like peace is an absence of war. Heat is cold is the absence of heat. Similarly, happiness is the absence of, material happiness is the absence of distress. But it's still a distressful situation, this happiness. Because then what happens is that it causes you to become more and more mad after it. You hanker after it, and you develop such a mad taste for such happiness. Therefore, Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that yehi sansparshaja bhoga dukkhayo naya evate. Actually, the greatest enemy of the living entity is satisfying his senses. Because what will happen after that? The mind then begins to extrapolate and expand and cause you to desire more and more to engage the senses with the sense objects. And it's just simply a farce. It's simply a farce, a facade that happens in the mind. But then when we engage the senses and the sense objects and become frustrated, when the momentary I guess, gap or this momentary opening of so-called happiness happens, then we think that, it was all worth it. It was all worth it. Prabhupada's writing, there's the quotes Prabhupada writes. Prabhupada says, home sweet home. But what is home sweet home? This person is going and endeavoring so hard to work outside, by the time he comes home, there's not enough time for sweet home. Right? He just works and works and works and comes home and he's completely knackered, completely smashed. He'll sleep and then again wake up and go to work again. Prabhupada comments on this in another place as well. He says that the modern civilization has become so difficult to live that even the child will not be able to understand who his parents are. Prabhupada gives the example, a child will not understand who the father is. But Kali Yoga has progressed to such an extent that the child does not know who his parents are. In the sense, the child is born, the child is young. By the time the child wakes up, the father goes to work early in the mornings to be able to travel all the way to his workplace. He'll work, and then in the evening, by the time he gets home, the child is asleep. So the child is not able to see his father. That's how Prabhupada says it. But nowadays, both parents work. And then they send their child to daycare. So it becomes such a difficult situation that what is really happiness is not really happiness. It is just simply a entanglement. It is simply a illusion to think that is happiness. And that's why when you understand the nature of material existence, you become frustrated. Vitaraga bhaya krodha manmaya mam upashitaha. That after this attachment to material nature and then becoming frustrated by it, then you'll develop some sort of detachment. And in that detachment one will start renouncing. But unfortunately the living entity's position is that he's entangled. So that is quite vividly displayed in the Smashana Vairagya principle, in the cemetery renunciation, that when a relative or a well-wisher dies, then everyone starts speaking great philosophy. But then what will happen? After a few months, years, again, back to the same old thing, back to the rat race. So the living entity has no idea of anything better. Therefore, when we read Srimad Bhagavatam, we can understand how by the mercy of the devotees, especially by Srila Prabhupada's mercy, we're able to understand how material nature is not in everything in of itself. There's something better than material existence. Often Prabhupada's disciples mention that when they were young, they were 20s, just young 20s, early 20s, when they performed devotional service, their whole mood at that time was, never trust anyone above the age of 30, that sort of thing. So their whole consciousness was just on youth, engaging the senses. But when it's mentioned when they read Srimad Bhagavatam about how the living entity exists within the womb, how the living entity after engaging in material existence finishes family life and then is rejected or in one sense put aside by family, then it becomes such a great revelation for them. And in fact, we also see it. Like, how do we know what happens within the womb? We don't know. But Kapila Dev is giving us that mercy to be able to understand how much suffering is there. But in material existence, birth is considered to be a great celebration. Right? It's a celebrated event. As if it was some sort of great, peaceful, joyful experience for the conditioned soul within the womb. But that's not able to be seen by the material conditioned living entities. Therefore, coming in contact with the living entities, that is also part of the Lord's plan for this material nature. And therefore we always should feel indebted to the devotees of the Lord, because there's no other way we'd be able to escape material existence other than for the mercy of the devotees. You cannot, when your hands are tied, Prabhupada says, when you're bound up, you need the help of the person who's unbound to be untied, to get out. And being tied up by the modes of nature, we require the help of those liberated souls to be able to come out of material existence. And sometimes we will see that when we read Srimad Bhagavatam, we'll come up with this idea that we should be delivered by only the Nitya Siddhas. Right? When it means the devotees will save us, it means the personal associates of the Lord will save us. But we don't have experience of that. In fact, we have experience of the servants of the servants of the servants of the Lord coming and delivering us. And it's mentioned that that position is the greatest position, it's the most powerful position. To become servant of the servant of the servant. And to be delivered by the servant of the servant of the servant means we'll be much more recognized than being the servant of the Lord. Because what will happen after that is that we'll become servant of the servant of the servant of the servant. And we will then please the devotees. And by pleasing those devotees, we'll please their superiors, and so on and so forth, all the way back to Srimati Radharani, who will then give pleasure to Krishna. And that is our parampara system. So we should always remember that understanding the nature of material existence, we should never give up or forget the mood of a devotee that is been mentioned so frequently in the last couple of weeks, that it began with Vidura showing humility, talking to Maitreya Muni. So the devotee is always submissive and surrendered to the Supreme Lord, understanding the position, how fallen they are, the wrong decision they made, and how by the mercy of the Lord through His devotees that we are able to come back to be able to perform some fraction of devotional service. Mahaprabhu is so merciful that it's mentioned that when he embraced King Maharaj Prataparudra, it's mentioned that he did not even know who that person he was embracing. Still, because Maharaj Prataparudra just quoted a verse from Gopi Geet, just quoted, not even his own verse. He simply repeated what Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya told him to do. Simply by doing that small amount of service, Mahaprabhu was so pleased that he embraced him and endowed with the love of Godhead. Therefore Rupa Goswami prays, Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratushe Namaha. This is the mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and it is flowing through the disciplic succession coming from Srila Prabhupada and his devotees. So you can understand a little bit. We talked about how living entities are unable to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, being completely contaminated. So therefore it's mentioned that the Vedic hymns give the suggestion to understand the sky as a representation of the Lord. Then we understand a bit more that how once we become more sensitive, once we become more and more cleansed from material existence, material contamination, then we'll be able to understand the Lord and appreciate the Lord's endeavors to help us bring us back home, back to Godhead. And it is all by the mercy of the devotees, and therefore we should engage in devotional service with that mood of humble, submissive service, completely dependent on the devotee's mercy. Just as Bhaktivinoda Thakur prays that I run after the devotee of Krishna, chanting Krishna Krishna. I don't run after Krishna chanting Krishna Krishna. I run after the devotee chanting Krishna Krishna. That you please, O He Vaishnav Thakur, please give me your mercy. Because without your mercy it's not possible to get Krishna's mercy. Okay, so I'll end here. If there are any questions, we can have them. Otherwise we'll end the class. Yes, Prabhu.
Just wondering if you know what is the difference between the Mahavishnu glancing of the dawn and then the activating diverse dawn. That and the universe is actually coming out of its source. Is it a sequential thing?
From understanding, I have to see, I can't remember exactly. I wouldn't know the difference between there. Would you know, Babu? I had this understanding that when Mahatat was there, the cloud is there, for anything to happen, the Lord glances. And then from there comes all of this thing happens one after the other, the manifestation of the tanmatras, the senses, everything, the basic reservoir of all of this. And then from that Mahavishnu breathes and then the universes come from there. That's my understanding. But I can't, this particular section, it doesn't particularly give it step by step. I guess we'll have to continue reading to understand a bit more. At least that's my understanding. At least from what I've read in Srimad Bhagavatam. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much for listening. Granthara Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Nitai Gaur Premanande, Hari Hari Bo.